Well, I think Don changed the face of dance, quite frankly. Uh, he didn't create a step, he created a style and a genre. And that genre, which brought street dance to a very.
In 1981, a petite woman in her late 30s, wearing a cheerleader's uniform and an electric smile, bounced across TV screens and made the world sing along to one of the most infectious hits in pop history. "Oh, Mickey, you're so fine. You're so fine, you blow my mind. Hey, Mickey." That woman was Toni Basil, dancer, choreographer, actress, director, and the voice behind one of the most iconic one-hit wonders of all time. The song became an anthem of the 80s, blasting through radios, roller rinks, and MTV screens across the globe. It sold millions, made headlines, and turned Toni into an overnight superstar. But behind that glittering success was a story far darker than anyone knew. Despite creating and performing the hit that defined an entire decade, Toni Basil saw little, if any, of the fortune that Mickey generated. Legal battles, lost royalties, and exploitation by the very industry she helped build left her fighting for credit, respect, and financial justice for decades. And perhaps the most painful twist? Toni Basil wasn't some naive newcomer. Before Mickey, she had already worked with legends like Elvis Presley, David Bowie, and Talking Heads. She had helped shape pop culture, only to be forgotten by it. This is the story of how a fiercely creative woman built an empire of rhythm and movement, only to watch it crumble in the hands of others. And how, even in her final years, Toni Basil refused to let the world write her off as just a one-hit wonder. Long before the cheerleader outfit and the MTV fame, Toni Basil was already a force of nature in the entertainment industry. Born Antonia Cristina Basilata in 1943, she grew up surrounded by music, dance, and showmanship. Her father was an orchestra leader, and her mother was a vaudeville performer, meaning Toni didn't just grow up near the stage. She practically lived on it. By her teens, she was already choreographing dance routines and appearing as an extra in films. Her energy was magnetic, part ballet grace, part street rhythm, and soon everyone in Hollywood seemed to know the name Toni Basil. She wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing movement, obsessed with how music and motion could tell a story without words. In the 1960s, she became a leading figure in the underground dance scene, choreographing for Shindig, and working alongside some of the biggest acts of the time, from Elvis Presley in Viva Las Vegas to David Bowie during his Glass Spider tour. She had an instinct for performance that set her apart, blending theatrical flair with precision and style. But it was in the early 80s, when MTV was just beginning to revolutionize the music world, that Toni decided to step into the spotlight herself. She had been experimenting with a catchy British tune called Kitty by the band Racy. Toni, with her visionary mind, saw something in that song. A spark. She reworked it, flipped the gender, added her own rhythmic chant, and turned it into Mickey. When she hit the studio, no one could have predicted what was coming. The track was pure energy, upbeat, punkish, and irresistibly fun. And Toni's cheerleader-inspired delivery gave it a personality all its own. The moment she sang, "Hey, Mickey!" it was electric. Then came the music video, and that's where Toni's genius truly exploded. Unlike most artists, she directed and choreographed it herself. At a time when few women had creative control in the industry, Toni made every decision, from the vintage cheerleading costume to the dance formations. She didn't just perform. She created a cultural moment. When Mickey hit MTV in 1982, it was an instant phenomenon. Viewers couldn't get enough of Toni's spunky moves and contagious charisma. Within weeks, the song topped charts in multiple countries. It became a symbol of the early MTV era, bright, bold, and impossible to forget. But what the world didn't see was how little Toni gained from her success. She wasn't signed to a powerful label with lawyers watching her back. She trusted people she thought were on her side. The contracts she signed were confusing, the royalty terms buried under industry jargon. While Mickey sold millions and generated enormous revenue, The bulk of that money went elsewhere, to producers, publishers, and corporations who knew how to exploit the system. Still, for Toni, those early days felt magical. "I was just happy to make something people loved," she once said in an interview. "I didn't know then how expensive that happiness would become." As the decade roared on, Mickey became more than a song. It was a pop culture symbol. Commercials, sports arenas, and television shows all used it. Everyone assumed Toni Basil was living in luxury off her global hit. But behind the scenes, she was watching others profit from her creation, and she was powerless to stop it. What began as a joyful dance, anthem would soon become the centerpiece of one of the most heartbreaking battles in music history. Because for Toni Basil, Mickey wasn't just a song. It was both her greatest triumph and the beginning of her downfall. As Mickey continued to climb the charts in 1982, Toni Basil became an unexpected pop icon. She was nearly 40, competing in a youth-obsessed industry, yet her energy and style made her seem timeless. The world saw her as a new star. But few realized she had already spent 2 decades behind the scenes, choreographing, directing, and shaping performances for others. Now, at last, it was her moment to shine. Everywhere she went, people shouted, "Hey, Mickey!" Fans copied her dance routines. Cheer squads across America used her moves in halftime shows. MTV replayed her video on endless rotation, and her face appeared on magazine covers around the world. Toni Basil had become the personification of early 80s pop, bold, bright, and unforgettable. But beneath the neon lights, trouble was brewing. At first, Toni didn't pay much attention to the business side of things. She had signed paperwork that, to her, seemed routine: royalty splits, licensing rights, publishing details. Like many artists of her time, she trusted the system. "I wasn't thinking about percentages," she said years later. "I was thinking about art." But soon the checks stopped coming. She noticed that while Mickey was being used everywhere, in movies, commercials, even video games, her bank account barely reflected it. People assumed she was a millionaire, but behind closed doors, Toni was struggling. The royalties that should have been hers were going to the wrong hands: record labels, publishers, and executives who had used fine print to claim ownership. For years, she tried to resolve it quietly. She sent letters, made calls, and asked questions, only to be met with silence or confusion. No one seemed willing to take responsibility. In the eyes of the industry, she was just a one-hit wonder. The song was bigger than the singer. By the late 80s, as pop culture moved on, Toni found herself boxed in by her own success. Everywhere she went, people wanted her to be the Mickey girl. Producers would call and ask her to recreate that cheerleader image, to dance the same routine, to sing the same song again. "They wanted nostalgia," she said bitterly. "I wanted evolution." Her refusal to conform made her an outsider in an industry she had helped shape. But Toni never stopped working. She returned to choreography, crafting iconic routines for legends like Tina Turner and Talking Heads. Her creative brilliance was undeniable. But financially, she was still paying the price for her biggest hit. Decades passed, and the injustice only deepened. Mickey was featured in films, ads, and TV shows, from Bring It On to Glee, yet Toni saw almost nothing from its endless replays. Each time the song resurfaced, it was a bittersweet reminder of the fortune she never received. In 2017, at 74 years old, Toni Basil finally decided enough was enough. She filed a lawsuit against multiple companies, including Warner Brothers and Viacom, for unauthorized use of her likeness and music. "All I ever wanted," she said, "was to be respected as the artist I am." The legal fight was long and draining, but even as she battled in court, the world began to rediscover her. Younger generations learned that Toni wasn't just the Mickey girl. She was a visionary who had choreographed, directed, and inspired some of the biggest names in entertainment. And while she may never have received the millions she deserved, Toni Basil's fight for recognition lit a fire under a new movement, one that demanded fairness for artists who had been cheated by the very industry that profited off their art. Still, the emotional toll was deep. Fame had brought her visibility, but it had also brought her pain. And as the years went on, Toni began to face an even harsher reality: the loneliness that comes when the world remembers your song, but forgets your name. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Toni Basil had already lived a lifetime of reinvention. She had danced with Elvis Presley, choreographed for Saturday Night Live, and shaped music videos for icons like David Bowie and Talking Heads. Yet when she walked through Hollywood now, people didn't see the pioneer, the choreographer, or the creative visionary. They saw the cheerleader from Mickey, and that realization hurt more than she ever admitted publicly. The entertainment industry is notoriously unkind to women as they age, especially to those who dare to age without apology. Toni had never tried to fit the mold. She didn't get caught up in trends, she didn't chase labels or fame, but as the years passed, the calls slowed down, the offers disappeared, and the world quietly moved on to younger, newer faces. She found herself drifting into the background of an industry she'd once electrified. Every so often, Mickey would resurface, in a car commercial, in a new movie, or at a sports game, and her phone would ring with friends saying, "Toni, they're playing your song again." She'd smile politely and thank them, but deep down she felt the sting. Each new use of her song was another reminder of what she didn't have: recognition, control, or compensation. In interviews, Toni would often deflect questions about money. "Art is my reward," she'd say. But close friends revealed she struggled quietly with financial instability. She lived modestly, often teaching dance workshops to make ends meet. Still, she refused to complain. "I've lived my life doing what I love," she said once. "That's more than most people can say." But behind the optimism was a growing sadness, not just about lost money, but about lost legacy. Younger artists didn't know her name. Choreographers who had been influenced by her work rarely credited her. Hollywood had conveniently forgotten that Toni Basil had helped invent the very aesthetic that made pop culture so vibrant: the fusion of dance, music, and visual storytelling that MTV would later build an empire on. In 2003, when Mickey was inducted into VH1's list of 100 Greatest Songs of the 80s, Toni wasn't even invited to the special taping. Her absence spoke volumes. "It's funny," she said later, "to see your life's work celebrated without you." Still, she didn't stop creating. Into her 70s, Toni continued teaching choreography, mentoring young dancers, and giving masterclasses around the world. Her body may have aged, but her energy was undiminished. She could still move with the rhythm and precision of someone half her age. Those who took her classes described her as magnetic, fierce, and endlessly passionate. Yet even as she smiled for students and fans, the legal battles over her music continued to drag on. The system that had robbed her decades earlier was slow to change. "It's like fighting smoke," she once said. "You can see it, you can feel it, but you can't grab it." The industry, meanwhile, had moved into the streaming era, and Mickey was once again everywhere. TikTok trends, retro playlists, nostalgia compilations, Toni's voice was being heard by a whole new generation. Millions of plays, millions of views, and still she received little more than a symbolic acknowledgement. In the quiet of her home, surrounded by trophies, vinyls, and photos of the people she'd worked with, Toni Basil often reflected on her journey. She wasn't bitter, just profoundly sad. "The world danced to my song," she said softly in one of her last recorded interviews. "But they never knew my story." For an artist who had spent her life helping others shine, Toni's greatest tragedy wasn't that she faded from fame, it was that she was never fully seen to begin with. As the years went by, Toni Basil continued to live on her own terms, fiercely independent, creative, and unwilling to surrender to the weight of time. In her 80s, while many of her peers had long since retired, Toni still showed up at dance studios wearing her trademark headbands and sneakers, ready to teach choreography that would exhaust dancers half her age. She didn't care about fame anymore. All she wanted was to move. But behind her resilience was a quiet heartbreak that never truly left her. The music industry that had celebrated her in the early 1980s never made amends for what it took away. The royalties from Mickey had been mismanaged and mishandled, leaving her without the financial security she had earned. Decades later, when she sued to reclaim her rights, the legal process proved to be long, expensive, and emotionally draining. "It's not even about the money," she told a friend once. "It's about justice, about being seen." Even as she fought, her health began to falter. Years of dancing had taken a toll on her body. The joints that once moved like silk now ached with arthritis. Her energy was still fierce, but her stamina waned. Yet Toni refused to show weakness. She'd smile, stretch, and lead her students through warm-ups, pretending not to notice the pain radiating through her legs. "Dance is my therapy," she'd say. "If I stop moving, I stop living." Friends often described her as both inspiring and heartbreaking, a living legend trapped in a world that no longer recognized her. Younger artists adored her once they met her, stunned to realize how much of their craft had been influenced by her choreography. But most had discovered her name too late. If she'd been born a man, one of her former collaborators said, the industry would have called her a genius decades ago. By her final years, Toni Basil's life had become a mixture of nostalgia and solitude. Her home was filled with mementos from her long career, photos with the Monkees, Elvis Presley, David Bowie, and even her younger self in that iconic cheerleader outfit. Every item told a story. Every frame held a memory. Yet she often sat among them in silence, reflecting on a life that had burned so brightly but ended so quietly. Her last public appearances were met with awe. When she performed at an awards event celebrating female pioneers in the music industry, the audience erupted into a standing ovation. Many didn't even realize the woman they were applauding was the Toni Basil, the woman who had helped define the look and sound of the 1980s. Her speech that night was short but unforgettable. "Fame comes and goes," she said, smiling through tears. "But art stays in the bones. Even when they forget your name, they can't erase your rhythm." A few months later, her health declined rapidly. Friends said she grew more reclusive, rarely answering calls, preferring to spend her days surrounded by her dogs and her old records. The music was her comfort. Her old recordings, her forgotten demos, her uncredited choreography reels. When she passed, quietly and without fanfare, the news barely made headlines. It wasn't until weeks later that social media rediscovered her story. Fans began sharing old clips of Mickey and interviews of Toni teaching dance classes well into her 70s. The world, suddenly reminded of her brilliance, responded with shock and admiration. "She deserved better," one fan wrote. "She gave us joy and we gave her silence." Toni Basil may have left the world quietly, but her influence remains deafening. Every music video with complex choreography, every viral dance trend, every pop song with visual storytelling, all carry traces of her legacy. Her tragedy wasn't in being forgotten. It was in being remembered too late.